Flowers have no inherent meaning. A rose does not mean love because a rose means love. Rather, a rose means love because centuries of poets and florists have imbued the rose with the meaning of love. The language of flowers is constructed from the ground up to convey in flora concepts and emotions. And so it is with all language. All thoughts, ideas, and concepts are portrayed through constructed verbiage. Even onomatopoeia, which is the portrayal of real sounds in language, is constructed. For example, in English, cats say meow. In Japan, cats, however, would say nya. Our epistemology, which is our understanding of thought and our theory of knowledge, is constructed and portrayed, taught, and learned in this unstable construct, which is called language. Also, flowers are buttholes. Welcome to the philosophy of Georges Bataille. Beginning this explication as one does with a discussion of the beginning, we actually notice at the bottom of the very first paragraph, Bataille puts his whole thesis out in very simple words. And I pause at the word whole thesis because, again, there is so much to unpack. When we're talking about the linguistic politic, he puts his entire linguistic political thesis out at the very beginning. And in the very basic words, he says that we are forced to, quote, reject as puerile absurdities certain attempts at symbolic interpretation, unquote. That is to say, to assign or glean meaning from flowers is childlike nonsense. The next passage, if we continue linearly, illustrates many of the symbolic interpretations that are common in poetry and floral language. For example, the dandelion conveys expansion, the narcissus conveys egoism, wormwood is bitterness, columbine is sadness, snapdragon is the emblem of desire, and the water lily is the emblem of indifference. And the rose, of course, is the symbol of love. The first three, these have very obvious meanings. The narcissus, for example, stems from this ancient myth where a man is so in love with himself that he stares down into the water until his body withers away, and in its place is left a flower. That flower is the narcissus. In this way, over the centuries, the narcissus flower has become to mean egoism. After we analyze the dandelion, the narcissus, and the wormwood, which have obvious meanings, the next ones are less obvious. The columbine, the snapdragon, the water lily are particularly difficult to understand why those things represent that which they do. Why, for example, is the snapdragon the emblem of desire? When we're talking specifically about the rose as well, Bataille raises the fair and good point that if I were to take a flower and present it to a loved one, any flower, that flower would then be imbued with the meaning of love. So Bataille writes at the end of the third paragraph that, quote, the aspect of love could then apply to, quote, flowers in general, and not to any specific flower. Here we see, within these first few paragraphs, the general breakdown of flower language in Bataille's writing. But this is, of course, pretty surface-level analysis. Anybody could read this and kind of gather this. I don't want to bore you with this kind of surface-level analysis. I want to provide you with the deep explication that I promised you. And that's why we're going to step over into another topic that is presented between the lines here. What Bataille is actually doing here is he's taking a low-level approach to the study of semiotics, or if you're a Saussurian, if you study it in a different way based on a different philosopher, this semiotics becomes known as semiology. What these actually refer to is just the study of signs. The basic structure of a semiological analysis in the Saussurian vernacular is the rose and the love, right? So you have the rose, which signifies love. Love, therefore, is signified by the rows. Take these together, you take the signifier and the signified, rose and love, and you put them together and you get the sign. You have the signifier, you have the signified, and you have the sign. You can use this semiotic structure as the basis for critical analysis, right? You could, for example, look at all of the metaphors or all of the imagery present in a work and use it through this sign, signified, signifier relationship and perform a full analysis and deduce a structure of that work. That is what we call structuralism. For example, if we were to go into a structuralist critique of the language of flowers, which itself invites you to reject structuralism, it's a weird thing. So we're going to perform this cursory structural critique, and we'll find that the word interpretation and meaning are actually paired with a lot of interesting terms. These terms that we pair with these interpretive meanings are terms like absurdities, quote, it matters little, quote, assigned importance, quote, purely subjective, and, quote, attributed meaning. Thus, a structural analysis would kind of lead us to believe that what Bataille wants us to get is that the sign, signified, signifier relationship is tumultuous at best and based on assigned meaning. So that's all well and good, right? We've used semiotics to attack semiotics, and we've used structural analysis to attack the basic structure. We've used structural analysis to attack the basic structure, right? We're actually taking structural analysis too far, and we're starting to see the whole thing unravel. How can the rose mean love when all flowers mean love? And how can all flowers mean love when the narcissus means egoism, and the wormwood means bitterness, and water lily means indifference? Everything starts to become more nonsense, even more assigned and arbitrary than Bataille might have originally led us to believe with just the text alone. What we're starting to see is that the entire relationship between flowers and meanings is beginning to break down. But that's not the point. Bataille never had any intent of telling you that flower and meaning is not related. What he's actually saying is, I want you to take the semiotic model, right? I want you to take the sign signified model and analyze it to the point where that model breaks down. Once the semiotic model breaks down, the entire structure of language begins to break down. A word can't just mean things because they mean things. We have to assign and create meanings for words. That becomes a problem in structuralism, where we want to find the meaning of things when in fact the meaning is created. Once we accept that all meaning is kind of assigned and arbitrary, and that things only have meaning when we decide that they have meaning, then we find ourselves actually addressing the basic foundations of thought and logic, which is, of course, language. We start to see language itself begin to unravel, and if you can't trust language, we have to start asking ourselves the hard questions. If we can't trust language, can we trust logic? Can we trust any structure as being inherently true and not an unstable construct? Can we trust our own thoughts? Have we not moved beyond structure entirely? If we start to philosophically or critically use this theory that all structures are made up, we have entered into this world that is known as post-structuralism. And we want to, post-structuralists want to address, critique, and question all inherent or supposed structures. It's all very depressing, isn't it? That the basic idea of thought and language has no inherent meaning, that everything we interact with, therefore, might not have any inherent meaning. It's all very depressing. But Bataille leaves us with a glimmer of hope. He writes that a, quote, disconcerting gesture of the Marquis de Sade, locked up with madmen who had the most beautiful roses brought to him, only to pluck off their petals and toss them into a ditch with liquid manure. He evokes this image of this old crazy pervert, that's who the Marquis de Sade was, locked up with other crazy people, plucking flowers off of a rose, plucking the petals, and throwing them into a trough of dung. And he asks us then, quote, in these circumstances, doesn't it have an overwhelming impact? So we say, yeah, of course, it's a very poetic image. If I remember that there is no inherent meaning to any of it, why is that a powerful image? How can that be a powerful image? Well, if there's no inherent meaning, it shouldn't be. But it is. Because meaning, as inherent as it isn't, is still real. Whatever something means to you is what it means, regardless of what the structure might say it means or doesn't mean. This goes back to the idea that a rose, that a water lily, which means indifference, can be given to a loved one and suddenly it means love. Meaning, as assigned and arbitrary as it may be, is real for the viewer. It's subjective. You create meaning every day. You create art or food or money or whatever it is you create, or even if you don't create, you partake in, and when you partake in something, your mind analyzes it. And in here, the unstable construct of thought, your unstable epistemology, in there, things take on meaning whether you want them to or not, right? This essay, The Language of Flowers by Georges Bataille, that essay potentially means nothing until I assign it a meaning. You might take an entirely different meaning from it. So, here you have it. I'm going to read my conclusion, pretty much line for line, because I think it's pretty good. This is the linguistic philosophy presented in The Language of Flowers. There is no inherent meaning to anything, not flowers, not your life, not even this essay. We can prove this point with semiotics and analysis of the sign, signifier, signified relationship. We can show this point with the structural reading. If we can move past the structural meaning, we can unlock the post-structural. Once in post-structural, we can question all meaning. We acknowledge beauty and assign our own meaning. There is, however, much more to this story. This essay will deal with death and decay, life and morality, good and evil, but it all hinges on this concept of assigned and inherent meaning. Hey, while I was editing this, I noticed a couple things. One, obviously, video is super not my forte. Critical theory, that's what I'm interested in. Video is just my way of telling the most people critical theory. Two, I never thanked you for watching. I really appreciate anybody watching. I really want people to kind of understand critical theory. I think it's important. And three, to any Bataille scholars out there or people who have no familiarity with Bataille, Bataille actually deals with a lot of more interesting and very specific topics, like the notion of expenditure, non-productive expenditure of energy, sacrifice, transgression, eroticism, waste, and like just the anus in general. And I never touched on these. My original script definitely had a lot of this, but but it ended up being way too long and way too cursory, and I wanted to get really deep into what I thought to be the main idea that could only be touched in the language of flowers, and that is the linguistic politic of Bataille. Maybe later, hopefully later, I'll actually go back and revisit some of the death and decay that you see in the language of flowers. And 3 or 4 or whatever we're on, I just want to make sure that my opinion that you don't take a YouTuber's point of view as fact is clear. I really want you to read the things that I talk about. The language of flowers, you should absolutely read it. It's only 4 pages long, and it's super interesting, and it takes this hard left turn. It seems like it's just going to be this basic idea of this linguistic politic, but it takes this hard left turn, and it turns into something entirely different, but that was way beyond the scope of this video. So make sure you read it. Make sure you, if you're interested in semiotics and that post-structuralism, that kind of thing, that you actually read Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies and Non-Moral Sense as well, because that essay really specifically deals with the nihilistic view of language, that it doesn't have any inherent meaning, and it predates this essay by a number of decades. So go ahead, check out these 2 essays. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll get better at making video in the future. Thanks.